Welcome back to Forgotten Women, a podcast that uncovers the stories of pioneers who transformed France but have been forgotten. I'm Hugo, and over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to tell you about Suzanne Brier and my interview with Michael Buckland. Today, we are going to delve into the 48-page manifesto of Suzanne Brier, What is Documentation, and how impactful it was in the life of Anglophones, even before her work being highlighted in France. Indeed, Brier argued that a document isn't merely text on paper, it's anything that serves as evidence, that informs and that represents. She was expanding the definition of knowledge. Doing so, she was preparing the ground for our digital age. And here's what's intriguing. In her manifesto, she poses a thought experiment. Is a star a document? Is a pebble a document? Is a living animal a document? Her answer is no. And here's the revolution. Photographs of stars are documents. Stones in a mineralogy museum are documents. Animals catalogued and displayed are documents. An antelope running free in Africa is just an antelope, but in a zoo or labeled and catalogued, it can become a document, indexed and a proof. It becomes a piece of knowledge. From that initial document, the catalogued antelope, flow secondary documents, newspaper articles, Anglophone scientific papers, conferences, and encyclopedia entries, recordings. Today, we are discussing with Michael Buckland, the scholar who helped me to better understand how he revived interest in Brier's work in the 90s. Note that American students from 3 universities found her ideas so inspiring, they started wearing t-shirts featuring her antelope. How can the contrast be so important between France and the Anglophone countries? That's what we're going to find out today. With all that I could gather, she was pretty forgotten in France compared to the US. That's what Sylvie told me.
Well, she was a prominent librarian in France, and well known. And she also wrote a remarkable manifesto. And probably she got fed up and took early retirement. I was told by a French librarian that there was no copy of her manifesto in any library in France, which is an extraordinary claim to make, but it might be true. Nobody took any interest in her, and a rather foolish American librarian disparaged what she wrote. That was almost the only thing that happened. Boyd Raywood, and he stopped me. He stopped me and he said, "Read this." And it was a photocopy of a page in French with my exact ideas, but 40 years earlier. I felt like an archaeologist who discovered a lost civilization. And I also had the privilege of going to France and giving the keynote lecture at a conference, but I couldn't resist. Keep referring to your great pioneer, Suzanne Brier, knowing that nobody in the audience knew who I was talking about. One of the people who saw my little biographical piece was a woman called Sylvie Fayet-Scribe. She was well known and prominent in her day. It's just, and that doesn't matter very much. And most of the active librarians of the 30s and the 40s, nobody remembers now. She wrote this interesting booklet. It had very interesting ideas in it, and nobody took any notice of it. And so it's become very influential. The symbol is her idea was an antelope could be a document, equating the term document with the concept of evidence. And a huge amount follows from that conceptually and theoretically, beginning to lead to huge changes in the theorizing of libraries and information science. As an introduction by a man called Ron Day, who's written quite a lot about this. And it has an English translation. And then it has an essay on what does she mean by saying that documentation is a cultural technique. And the article that I translated by Suzanne Brier, which dealt with the social context leading women, a complex setup of many different associations.
I think it was also a difficult period to talk historically, because it's starting from the war period and the post-war period. So there's a lot of political conflicts, these tensions.
Brier was working as a librarian during the Second World War.
That's when the tension started, I think. Her publishing what is documentation went under the radar. There was a lot of tension in the field of documentation.
She co-organized a professional training for documentalists in Paris at CNAM. One of her students, Robert Paget, wrote a very remarkable paper, a student thesis that was published as an article, striking phrase in it, which translated, documentation is to culture what machinery is to industry. I came across it a couple of years ago. I had it republished with a translation and an introduction. He wrote about a gorilla in a cage as a document. And this was earlier than Brier. It's 99% certain that this was her ideas, and he was one of her students and learned from her that way. He became a leading researcher in social psychology later on. It's also relevant that the academic side of documentation went in a unique way in France.
Because there was conflict with different departments. That's what I recall.
My version of it, there is and was a school of librarianship en Cibes, now in Lyon. But that was a professional school, a grandes écoles. And the people interested in, academics interested in documentation, they were not regarded officially as being an academic discipline. And by French logic, you can't have a department if you don't have a recognized discipline. And they decided that they were never going to make the grade. They were never going to succeed. And another group, people into media, communications, came to the same conclusion, that they weren't going to make it either. So as a political move, they combined as SIC, S-I-C, Sciences d'Information et Communication, and somehow persuaded the government that this was a discipline, singular, and a number of programs were started. And so the whole area was neglected in France after a golden era at the INTD at CNAM in the late 40s, early 50s. It sort of died out of neglect, in strong contrast to the way it developed in Anglophone countries.
And that conflict, opposing department that did not exist in the Anglophone country, like all those merging.
The situation was different. It had a very well established suite of schools of librarianship, starting in 1887, I guess.
So there was bigger rooted ideas from librarianship.
Yes, and very established, and an accepted qualification for running libraries. And there was some tension, but later, after the Second World War, between people interested in information for science, in a narrow sense, science and technology, who didn't necessarily want to be called librarians. And librarians diversified and included documentation and what's vaguely referred to as information science, and sometimes into archives in a very strong way. And that is what was missing in France. What she discovered on her visit to the United States in 1954, or whenever, is that what she regarded as a documentation center was called a special library. That's the terminology in England and Anglophone countries. Special library doesn't mean the library is special, it means it's specialized. And few people realized that these were the same thing. And this is what Suzanne Brier discovered when she came to visit the United States. The academics realized that when you're talking about the flow of information, you're talking about a social activity, and therefore they should turn their attention to the social sciences, and forgot that there was a war going on, supposedly, between traditional librarians and information scientists. The field has recovered from this, finally, but that was a very foolish and damaging development in Anglophone countries, and also in other countries. Historical development of libraries in France is very peculiar, and it's been radically different, fundamentally different from the development in the UK and the US. And there's complex reasons for it, all of which have to do with French political traditions and French society. In America in particular, public libraries were local, not controlled by Paris. Think of that.
In France, it's structured by the Culture Ministry, so there's that distinction between France and the US in the way libraries are structured because of the government's
yes, in the UK and in the United States, public libraries in particular are absolutely local initiatives. The federal government, until our present fascist leadership, supplies funding, but they don't control the public libraries, they don't initiate them, they don't have anything to do with them. The local state, the individual, will have laws enabling them and appealing for philanthropy to keep them going. This is totally the opposite of the historic French administrative structure. Paris controls everything, and only Paris pays for anything. She wasn't particularly forgotten, but her booklet, her What is Documentation, was forgotten. The present Institut National de Technique de Documentation, that's big and healthy. One of the weak parts, I think, is the failure to develop strong professional education for librarians. Whereas in the UK and the United States and Australia and Canada, there have always been multiple schools competing with each other and interacting with each other. There was a strong American impulse to improve libraries in France between the two world wars, for but CARD, Committee for Aid to the Région Dévastée. An English woman organized and funded an initiative to send Americans, doctors and teachers and others, to help the communities which had been devastated. And she stayed on, and they started to develop libraries in this terribly devastated area. The American Library Association decided that France needed better professional education for libraries. And so the American Library Association created a school of librarianship in Paris. It was known familiarly as the L'École du Wild West. It didn't last for many years, but it did have a strong influence in terms of bringing in new ideas. And probably that was associated with a change in the composition of French librarians from being primarily men to primarily women. There were all these different organizations with overlapping interests, and the same people popping up in one organization after another.
Organism like that didn't stay long because they were not recognized by the government.
It was sort of outside the government, dictatorship. At the present moment, all this is changing. Specialists are much more integrated internationally than before.
I'm Hugo. This has been Forgotten Women. Till then, keep asking questions.